Hello, I'm hello. I'm Dr. Joseph Dillard. Welcome to Integral Deep Listening Dream Yoga, Healing, Balancing, and Transformation in an Evolutionary Context. Why dreaming, listening, and decentralization matter for human development. Now that you have learned the basics of IDL interviewing, your next step toward coaching accreditation in IDL Dream Yoga is to familiarize yourself with the ways interviewing is used for personal development and in service to others. Over the course of this presentation, we will explore three core modules. Hello, I'm Joseph Dillard. Now that you have learned the basics of IDL interviewing, your next step toward coaching accreditation in IDL Dream Yoga is to familiarize yourself with the ways interviewing is used for personal development and in service to others. Over the course of this presentation, we will explore three core modules: healing, balancing, and transformation. Each module builds on the previous, integrating theory, clinical practice, and reflective exercises. You'll learn how to align both your identity and dreaming with innate emerging potentials of evolution. The goal is to provide a structured path for evolutionary self-development, enabling both practitioner growth and client empowerment. Learning objectives. By the end of this presentation, you will be able to identify patterns in client dreams, internalized voices, and relational dynamics. You will gain tools to access the adaptive and maladaptive functions of these patterns and to guide clients toward healthier organization within and among the three domains: interpersonal, cognitive, and dreaming. Practical outcomes include the ability to conduct IDL-informed interviews, recognize toxic scripting, trauma, and thinking, and support interview-produced interventions that promote systemic flexibility. Beyond therapy, these skills allow coaches and clinicians to support evolutionary growth in their clients, facilitating not just symptom relief, but deeper self-organization and resilience. Why do intelligent, well-intentioned people remain trapped in repeating emotional, relational, and cognitive patterns? At the heart of the human problem is a paradox. Intelligent, well-intentioned people often find themselves repeating the same emotional, relational, and cognitive patterns, even when these patterns cause suffering or limit growth. It is crucial to understand that these individuals are not broken. Rather, they are the product of adaptive processes, systems shaped over time to protect, survive, and maintain coherence in a world that demanded constant adjustment. These adaptations, while once essential, can become over-adaptations. Behaviors that once ensured safety, social inclusion, or personal survival can calcify into rigid habits or attractor basins, making it difficult to break free. In this sense, the very strategies that once promoted flourishing in challenging environments may now block further growth, emotional flexibility, and relational harmony. The IDL framework addresses this problem by helping clients recognize the evolutionary logic of their adaptations, differentiate between adaptive and maladaptive expressions, and cultivate the ability to reorganize themselves systematically. Through dreaming, reflection, and guided interventions, individuals can begin to loosen rigid patterns, reclaim adaptive flexibility, and step into new possibilities for growth, connection, and transformation. Evolutionary context. IDL frames healing and transformation through an evolutionary lens. Consciousness and meaning are not just byproducts of life, they are emergent forces that shape adaptation and survival. Dreams, in particular, are a form of self-organization, allowing the mind to explore potential solutions, reprocess experiences, and reorganize internal systems without the interference of habitual waking narratives. By listening in a deep and integral way to intrinsic, relatively autonomous perspectives in dreaming, waking life issues, and transpersonal experiences, IDL practitioners help clients identify emerging potentials that otherwise remain inchoate. This approach positions streaming as a natural counterbalance to rigid adaptive attractors, preventing maladaptive entrenchment and facilitating evolutionary flexibility. Systems and chaos perspectives. Human behavior exists within dynamic systems, constantly interacting with biological, social, and cultural influences. Chaos theory reminds us that even small perturbations in these systems, such as a dream experience or reflective practice, can lead to significant changes over time. At the same time, maladaptive attractor basins can lock individuals or groups into repetitive, self-defeating patterns. IDL equips coaches and clinicians to map these systems, identify where toxic scripting or recurrent drama emerges, and guide interventions that promote adaptive self-organization. By understanding feedback loops and attractor dynamics, practitioners can intervene strategically, enhancing the likelihood of sustainable change without imposing linear or prescriptive solutions. The three domains. IDL organizes human experience into three interdependent domains: interpersonal, cognitive, and dreaming. The interpersonal domain reflects interaction with the outer reality of our family, peers, and communities. The cognitive domain includes who we experience ourselves to be, our thoughts, emotions, intentions, worldview, and core identity. The dream domain includes not only dreams and nightmares, but transpersonal experiences. It is called the intrasocial domain because it involves how we relate to subjective yet relatively autonomous others. To the extent that our interpersonal and cognitive domains are dreamlike, in that we wake up out of our current framings, they are also, in a broader context, dream domains. Understanding these domains allows practitioners to identify where maladaptive patterns originate, how they reinforce each other, and how interventions in one domain ripple across the others. Dreaming functions as a decentralized rebalancing mechanism, integrating all three domains to maintain systemic health. Three modes of human functioning. What are the three fundamental modes through which humans adapt and evolve? Human beings adapt and evolve through three fundamental modes of functioning, each of which serves a distinct and necessary role. Psychological health does not depend on the dominance of any one mode, but on the capacity for functional dialogue along all three. The first mode is waking identity. This is the mode of survival, control, and maintenance. It governs goal-directed behavior, boundary setting, problem solving, and self-protection. Waking identity is essential for navigating daily life and maintaining stability. However, when it becomes dominant or rigid, it tends to suppress alternative perspectives and reduces experience to efficiency, threat management, and control. The second mode is dreaming. Dreaming decentralizes waking identity and reorganizes experience. In this mode, attention loosens from linear logic and fixed self-definitions, allowing new associations, emotional integrations, and symbolic reorganizations to occur. Dreaming supports psychological integration by bringing forward marginalized and emerging perspectives that are excluded during waking control. This mode enables adaptation through reconfiguration rather than force. The third mode is deep listening or witnessing. This mode does not act or reorganize directly. Instead, it coordinates across perspectives. Deep listening provides the capacity to observe, hold, and relate multiple viewpoints without collapsing into identification with any single one. It creates coherence by allowing waking identity and dreaming processes to communicate rather than compete. This witnessing function supports integration by facilitating dialogue rather than dominance. Health emerges when these three modes are in functional relationship. Waking identity provides structure, dreaming enables reorganization, and deep listening coordinates meaning across perspectives. Dysfunction arises when one mode attempts to replace the others, when control suppresses dreaming, when dreaming overwhelms structure, or when witnessing is absent. Psychological maturity is marked not by mastery of a single mode, but by fluid movement and dialogue among all three. Reframing outdated adaptations. What if many psychological problems are not pathologies, but outdated adaptations? IDL invites a shift in how we understand many psychological difficulties. What if a significant number of what we label as symptoms or pathologies are actually outdated adaptations, strategies that once supported survival but no longer fit current conditions? From an evolutionary perspective, selection favors viability, not happiness, insight, or flexibility. The nervous system is optimized to keep organisms alive long enough to reproduce, not to maximize well-being or self-understanding. As a result, many psychological strategies are shaped by survival priorities rather than long-term health. Survival intelligence is also conservative by design. Once a strategy proves effective under threat, such as hypervigilance, emotional suppression, avoidance, or control, it is strongly reinforced. The system prefers the familiar and the proven, even when circumstances have changed. These adaptations often persist long after the original conditions are no longer present. What once protected against danger may later interfere with intimacy, creativity, or growth. The nervous system does not automatically update its strategies simply because the environment has become safer. Human systems also tend to overlearn that which was once worked. Repetition strengthens neural behavioral patterns, making them resistant to revision. Over time, adaptive responses can become rigid habits that are experienced as problems, even though they originated as solutions. Reframing psychological difficulties in this way reduces stigma and opens the door to curiosity. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with this person?" we can ask, "What problem was this strategy originally solving? And does it still need to?" This shift creates space for dialogue, integration, and adaptive updating rather than suppression or correction. The problem of fossilized adaptation. What happens when adaptation becomes rigid? What happens when adaptive strategies lose their flexibility and become rigid? Adaptation, by definition, is meant to be responsive. But when conditions change and strategies do not, adaptation can harden into what we might call fossilized adaptation. One sign of this rigidity is the deepening of attractor basins. Over time, certain emotional, cognitive, and behavioral patterns become increasingly easy to fall into and increasingly difficult to exit. The system defaults to familiar responses even when they are no longer effective. As a result, repetition replaces learning. Instead of generating new information from experience, the system reenacts the same responses, reinforcing existing patterns. Novelty is filtered out, and feedback that could support change is ignored or misinterpreted. When flexibility decreases, drama escalates. Recurrent emotional intensities often emerge as the system attempts to resolve unresolved conflicts using outdated tools. The intensity increases, but the repertoire of responses remains limited. Cognition also narrows. Thinking polarizes, moving toward either or interpretations, rigid narratives, and moralized positions. Complexity becomes threatening, and ambiguity is avoided. Over time, identity hardens around these patterns. Roles, self-descriptions, and narratives form that stabilize the system but also constrain it. What began as a functional adaptation becomes a defended sense of who I am. This state can be described as maladaptive stability, a condition in which the system remains organized and predictable, but at the cost of responsiveness, learning, and growth. From an IDL perspective, the task is not to disrupt stability for its own sake, but to restore dialogue among perspectives so that adaptation can resume. Why self-improvement fails. Why do insight, willpower, and self-improvement often fail to produce lasting change? It is important to address a paradox that many people encounter. Insight increases, effort intensifies, and motivation is genuine, yet lasting change remains elusive. From an evolutionary and systems perspective, this is not a personal failure, but a structural one. The core issue is that the self is an adaptation manager, not an evolution engine. The waking identity evolved to maintain viability, coherence, and continuity under known conditions. Its primary function is stabilization, not transformation. Expecting it to generate deep reorganization places it outside its design parameters. When change is attempted through conscious control, existing attractor patterns are often reinforced rather than altered. Attention, intention, and discipline tend to circulate within familiar loops. What feels like effort toward change may actually deepen the grooves of what is already habitual. Similarly, effort strengthens identity rather than updating it. Striving usually presupposes a stable I who is trying to improve itself. This reinforces identification with the very structures need to loosen. The system works harder, but it works in the same way. As a result, most interventions operate within the same underlying structure they are attempting to change. Techniques are applied by the same self, using the same interpretive frames, managing the same internal hierarchy of perspectives. From this viewpoint, change fails not because of insufficient effort, but because effort amplifies what already exists. Without accessing modes of functioning capable of decentralization and reorganization, such as dreaming and deep listening, the system cannot update its assumptions or reorganize its internal relationships. IDL approaches change not by optimizing the self, but by creating conditions in which new information can enter the system and reconfigure it from within. Why IDL exists? What if we could listen to the system's intelligence instead of forcing it to change? We can clarify the operating principles behind integral deep listening. It begins with a fundamental shift in stance. Listening replaces forcing. Instead of directing the system toward predefined outcomes, IDL assumes that the system already contains the interdependent relationships needed for its own reorganization. Non-interpretive listening is central. IDL does not translate experiences into symbolic meanings or impose explanatory frameworks. Perspectives are approached as expressions of lived function, not as representations of something else. This preserves informational integrity and avoids distortion. IDL emphasizes perspective inclusion rather than correction. Internal viewpoints, whether emotional, imaginal, somatic, or behavioral, are not treated as problems to be fixed. They are contributors to the system's adaptive competence. Inclusion changes system dynamics more effectively than confrontation or suppression. The focus is on function over identity. IDL is less concerned with who a perspective claims to be and more interested in what it does, what it needs, and how it contributes to overall coordination. This shifts attention away from defended narratives and toward practical systemic roles. Finally, IDL operates through minimal intervention with maximal leverage. Rather than applying force, effort, or prolonged analysis, it introduces precise listening at points of greatest informational density. As Nobel Prize-winning complexity and system scientist Ilya Prigogine noted, when a complex system is far from equilibrium, small islands of coherence in a sea of chaos have the capacity to shift the entire system to a higher order. Together, these principles explain why IDL exists, not as another method of self-improvement, but as a disciplined way of restoring dialogue, adaptability, and evolutionary movement within human systems. Why healing comes first. Why can't we skip directly to transformation? Healing is the necessary first phase in any durable process of change. The question it raises, why can't we skip directly to transformation, challenges a common assumption in personal growth culture that insight or transcendence can bypass unresolved adaptation. The first reason is that unhealed systems resist balance. When survival scripts are still active, the system prioritizes protection over coordination. Attempts to reintroduce balance are interpreted as threats, and defensive patterns reassert themselves. Second, unbalanced systems distort insight. Information is filtered through the needs of dominant perspectives. Even accurate insights are co-opted to justify existing strategies, reinforcing rather than loosening maladaptive attractors. Third, Transformation without healing destabilizes function. Introducing decentralization or expanded perspectives into a system still organized around threat can lead to fragmentation, overwhelm, or loss of coherence. What appears as breakthrough may actually be loss of regulatory capacity. From an IDL perspective, healing is not about fixing damage or correcting flaws. It is about restoring functional flexibility by releasing toxic survival scripts, patterns that once supported viability but now constrain responsiveness. This is why the first of IDL's 3 units on healing focuses on understanding and repurposing our scripting. Only when the system is no longer dominated by defensive imperatives that balance emerges naturally. And only then can transformation occur without compromising stability. Healing creates the conditions in which deeper reorganization becomes both possible and sustainable. Ways IDL differs in clinical practice. We need to situate integral deep listening within the broader landscape of clinical approaches by clarifying what it does differently, not what it does better. IDL is compatible with many modalities, but it operates from a distinct set of assumptions. First, IDL differs from symptom management. While symptom relief can be necessary and humane, IDL does not treat symptoms as targets for elimination. Symptoms are viewed as functional signals emerging from adaptive systems. The clinical task is to listen to what the symptom is organizing and protecting, rather than suppressing it prematurely. Second, IDL differs from interpretive psychology. IDL does not translate experiences into symbolic meanings, diagnostic categories, or explanatory narratives imposed from the outside. Dream images, emotions, behaviors, and somatic responses are not interpreted about the client. They are invited to speak as themselves. This preserves informational fidelity and avoids therapist-driven meaning-making. Third, IDL differs from egocentric growth models. Many approaches assume a central self that must be strengthened, optimized, or made more coherent. IDL instead decentralizes the waking identity and works with multiple perspectives as semi-autonomous functional contributors. Growth is defined as improved coordination among perspectives, not the dominance of one. Clinically, this means the therapist functions less as an expert who directs change and more as a facilitator of structured listening. Change emerges through inclusion and dialogue, allowing the system to reorganize according to its own intelligence rather than an imposed model. The first modality of integral deep listening focuses on healing, understood not as symptom removal, but as the restoration of functional flexibility. Healing addresses the conditions that prevent balance and transformation from occurring safely and sustainably. The initial task is identifying toxic scripts. These are survival-based patterns of thought, emotion, behavior, and expectation that once supported viability, but now generate unnecessary suffering or rigidity. IDL surfaces these scripts by listening to the perspectives that enact them, rather than analyzing them from the outside. A key outcome of this work is escaping drama across multiple domains: relationships, thinking, and dreaming. Drama arises when perspectives compete for control without coordination. Through structured interviewing, IDL reduces reactivity by allowing each perspective to express its function directly, dissolving repetitive emotional escalations and polarized narratives. Healing also establishes cognitive clarity. As survival-driven distortions relax, perception becomes more accurate and less defensive. Clients often report increased mental spaciousness, improved decision-making, and a greater capacity to distinguish present conditions from past adaptations. In IDL, healing is not an endpoint. It creates the internal conditions necessary for balance by loosening rigid attractors and quieting defensive urgency. Once these constraints are reduced, the system is capable of engaging in deeper coordination and reorganization without destabilization. What is healing? Healing in IDL is defined not as the removal of pain, but as the instantiation of selfless reorganization and systemic integrity. Selfless reorganization refers to both the decentering of the self and adaptation as ongoing rather than a destination. Symptoms are signals of blocked energy, maladaptive scripting, or misaligned relational patterns. Recognizing these signals allows clinicians to facilitate processes where clients can reorganize internally and relationally, leading to authentic transformation. Dreams serve as a natural healing modality, providing a safe place for identity to be temporarily suspended, to rebalance, and integrate experience. This approach emphasizes that healing is iterative and ongoing, rather than linear, fostering resilience and adaptability across the interpersonal, cognitive, and dreaming domains. Healing through dreaming. Dreams act as a selfless, decentralized mechanism for reorganizing both interior and objective experience. Through dreaming, we can explore alternatives, resolve unresolved conflicts, and realign behaviors that are out of sync with evolutionary and developmental imperatives. IDL enhances this natural process by structuring interviews and reflective exercises that disclose and amplify innate integrative potentials. Practitioners structure the deep listening process and guide clients in application of those recommendations that make sense to them, thereby bridging the gap between emerging evolutionary potentials and waking integration. Scripting and its role in healing. Scripting is the pre-programmed set of behaviors and expectations we inherit biologically as the children of our parents, culturally, and socially. While these scripts serve adaptive functions by guiding our development, maintaining social cohesion, and transmitting knowledge, they can also become toxic, creating self-defeating patterns in relationships, thinking, and dreaming. IDL identifies these scripts and works to restore balance, not by erasing them, but by helping clients recognize their function, identify maladaptive expressions, and integrate new adaptive behaviors identified and supported by interviewed emerging potentials. Through dream-centered practices, reflection, and guided intervention, clients develop flexibility, allowing healthy scripts to guide rather than constrain behavior. Toxic trauma manifests as recurring conflicts and emotional loops that undermine systemic health. While emotional conflict itself has evolutionary utility by way of signaling threats, mobilizing resources, and enforcing social norms, unresolved or mismanaged patterns create rigid attractor bases that trap individuals in self-defeating cycles. IDL provides strategies to interrupt these cycles by accessing, becoming, and internalizing innate perspectives that have not been scripted into drama, and then practicing their non-reactivity to scripted life circumstances, identifying triggers, and facilitating reflective engagement. By creating space for access and application, practitioners help clients transition from reactive drama to conscious adaptive action. Toxic thinking encompasses distortions of reality that arise from adaptive heuristics, social pressures, or developmental limitations. These include emotional cognitive distortions, cognitive biases, and logical fallacies, all of which may have historical or evolutionary utility, but now impair systemic function. IDL helps clients recognize these patterns within themselves and others, contextualizing them in evolutionary and systems terms. By reframing cognitive processes and facilitating access to innate perspectives that think relatively clearly, clients can reduce rigidity, expand perspective, and foster more adaptive, creative, and cooperative thinking. From healing to balancing. Healing reveals what hurts and why, but healing, while necessary, is insufficient. Many people experience moments of clarity, emotional release, or symptom reduction only to find themselves reverting to old patterns under stress, or simply due to the inertia of deeply embedded adaptive patterns. This is not failure. It reflects the absence of balancing capacities that allow healing to consolidate into daily functioning. Balancing provides the scaffolding that allows healing to endure. It builds self-regulation, perspective taking, and behavioral flexibility so that healing can be integrated and maintained. In IDL, balancing is not about control, but about functional coordination among inner systems. Balancing is the phase where the system regains functional coordination after toxic scripts have been reduced. It is not about optimization or peak performance, but about restoring reliable self-regulation across contexts. In IDL, goal setting is treated as provisional and dialogical. Goals are not imposed by waking identity alone, but are tested through feedback from dreaming and interviewed perspectives. A goal is considered functional only if it aligns across multiple personal, social, and intrasocial viewpoints. Assertiveness in IDL operates across the three domains of relationships, thinking, and dreaming. Rather than pushing or collapsing assertiveness, rather than pushing or collapsing, assertiveness involves accurate boundary signaling, saying yes or no or not yet in ways that preserve system coherence rather than provoke interior relationship resistances. IDL uses triangulation for superior problem solving. Instead of relying on a single narrative or authority, the issue is approached from at least three perspectives. Typically the input of others, our waking preferences, and that of a relevant dream or symptom perspective. Solutions emerge from pattern convergence rather than force. Balancing succeeds when decisions feel less effortful, conflicts de-escalate faster, and the systems respond with flexibility instead of reactivity. The three domains revisited. Balancing must occur across all three domains of experience. Relationships involve emotional regulation, boundary awareness, and communication. Thinking involves cognitive flexibility and the ability to hold uncertainty. Dreaming involves engagement with the other, whether real or fantasy, without dissociation or inflation. When one domain dominates, imbalance results. For example, excessive cognitive control can suppress emotional and imaginal intelligence, while uncontained dreaming can destabilize waking identity. IDL works to synchronize these domains. Why balancing is developmental. Balancing is not merely corrective, it is developmental. Different stages of psychological development require different balancing skills. What stabilizes a child may constrain an adult. What grounds a traumatized client may frustrate a seeker of transformation. IDL honors this developmental reality by following the priorities of those innate perspectives that authentically reflect the client's present level of development and speak in ways that relate to their current worldview. Balancing is therefore not about imposing ideals, but about supporting growth at the edge of chaos. Goal setting is balancing. In IDL, goals are not rigid endpoints, but orienting vectors. Healthy goal setting provides direction while remaining responsive to feedback from experience. When goals become inflexible, they often reinforce toxic scripting or self-judgment. Balancing-oriented goal setting emphasizes learning over achievement. Goals become experiments rather than tests of worth, allowing the system to adjust intelligently rather than collapse under pressure. Assertiveness is often misunderstood as dominance or confrontation. In IDL, assertiveness means the capacity to express, negotiate, and revise positions without aggression or withdrawal. It is essentially a phenomenological position of openness associated with the laying aside of assumptions conjoined with persistent questioning. While relational assertiveness often involves clear boundaries and authentic expression, cognitive assertiveness involves questioning assumptions without rigidity. Imaginal assertiveness allows engagement with dream figures and imagery without submission or suppression. Together, these stabilize identity while preserving openness. IDL problem solving uses triangulation, listening to multiple perspectives within and across domains. Instead of forcing solutions, the system gathers information from relational, cognitive, and imaginal sources. This process reduces waking fixation and increases functional intelligence. Problems are reframed as signals of imbalance, inviting inquiry rather than control. Receiving the input of interviewed intrasocial perspectives that know and understand us and our life issues provides important subjective sources of objectivity to aid in problem solving. Transformation in IDL is not about becoming better, happier, or more enlightened. It is about reorganizing how the system listens to itself across time, state, and perspective. Meditation functions here as perceptual retraining. Rather than cultivating special states, it stabilizes the capacity to observe patterns without immediately intervening. This creates the conditions for self-correction to emerge from the system, rather than being imposed by effort. 7-octave pranayama works directly on physiological and attentional bandwidth. By engaging multiple energetic and respiratory ranges, it increases the system's tolerance for complexity and novelty. Transformation requires sufficient capacity to remain present while structures reorganize. Dream incubation and intention introduce dialogue with future organization. Instead of analyzing dreams after the fact, the system is invited to participate prospectively, posing questions, setting conditions, and listening for responses that arise outside waking control. Living in dialogue with emergence means relinquishing authorship. Decisions are no longer driven solely by identity, habit, or insight, but by ongoing feedback from multiple perspectives: waking, dreaming, somatic, and witnessing. The central question of transformation is not, what should I become? It is rather, what would change if my system learned how to listen to itself? When that capacity stabilizes, change no longer needs to be forced. It begins to coordinate itself. Transformation is often confused with improvement. In IDL, transformation does not mean feeling better, functioning better, or even coping better. Those belong primarily to healing and balancing. Transformation refers to a change in the structure of identification itself, how experience is organized, owned, and enacted. Where healing reduces suffering and balance increases functional effectiveness, transformation loosens the assumption that the self is the center and owner of experience. This is not dissociation. It is not detachment from life, but a reorganization of how experience is related to, allowing behavior, emotion, and meaning to arise with less compulsive self-reference. Why is transformation necessary? Adaptive systems eventually reach limits. A person may be healed and well-balanced, yet still experience stagnation, repetition, or existential contraction. This occurs when identity structures themselves become fossilized attractor basins, preventing further responsiveness to emerging conditions. From an evolutionary perspective, transformation is not optional. It is how systems avoid long-term maladaptation. Transformation allows the system to release identification with outdated survival strategies, making room for participation in futures that cannot be predicted from the past. Why do most transformational experiences not last? Most attempts at transformation fail not because people lack sincerity or effort, but because they underestimate the inertia of long-established attractor basins. Human systems are designed to conserve what has worked before, even when it no longer serves current conditions. We see this clearly in everyday efforts like changing diet or exercise habits. Early on, the benefit-cost gradient favors change. Motivation is high, rewards are immediate, and costs feel manageable. Over time, however, those costs accumulate. Time, effort, social friction, discomfort, while the perceived benefits stabilize or fade. Eventually, the gradient reverses. This dynamic helps explain why even profound events, mystical experiences, breakthroughs, insights, Near-death experiences so often fail to produce lasting transformation. The experience may feel definitive, even life-altering, but the underlying adaptive structures remain largely unchanged. The system slowly reverts. For this reason, IDL does not focus on achieving insight as a primary mechanism of change. Insight is often overvalued because it delivers a powerful, effective hit, a sense of clarity, meaning, or transcendence that can become subtly addictive. But intensity is not the same as integration. What actually supports durable change is structure and discipline, the kind provided by a yoga. Not a heroic moment, but a repeatable practice that incrementally reshapes attractor landscapes over time. Transformation lasts when it is scaffolded, not when it is merely felt. IDL uses a revision of the classical Buddhist framework of the five skandhas, not as metaphysical doctrine, but as a functional map of identification. Each skandha represents a domain where the self habitually attaches, invests, and claims ownership. Transformation involves learning to recognize when identity collapses into any one of these domains and gently disentangling from that investment without suppressing or rejecting the experience itself. A core IDL meditation skill is the ability to name whatever arises: sensation, image, emotion, thought, or awareness itself, and then return to simple observation of the six components of every breath. Naming prevents fusion. Returning prevents fixation. Together, they create a stable loop of recognition and release that supports long-term transformation. IDL 7-octave pranayama trains awareness to track the breath across 7 nested layers of experience, each representing a distinct mode of relationship to breathing rather than a technique to be mastered. At the first octave, attention rests in direct sensory awareness, the felt texture, rhythm, and movement of the breath. This establishes grounding without interpretation. The second octave observes breath as a microcosm, mirroring the macrocosmic round of every day and life. The third octave introduces emotional affirmation, recognizing the affective tone that accompanies breathing and allowing it to be present without amplification or suppression. The fourth octave attends to core qualities, such as awakening, aliveness, and balance, that naturally emerge when breathing is observed rather than controlled. At the fifth octave, transformational affect may arise, awakenings of transpersonal affect that signal a repatterning of identification rather than emotional discharge. The sixth octave involves emptying, where effort, commentary, and self-reference progressively release, allowing openness and non-reactivity to occur without intervention. The seventh octave takes the perspective of breath and life breathing us. Breathing is no longer something the practitioner does, but a perspective and context that includes and transcends who we are, something transpersonal we are growing into. This octave directly supports transformational decentering and participatory awareness. So let's do a reality check. Interviewed perspectives in IDL do not organize experience around the distinctions that structure waking identity. They do not reliably separate waking from dreaming, self from other, or reality from fantasy. Because of this, they tend to express transpersonal and non dual orientations naturally, without effort or belief. This does not make them superior. It simply reflects a different way of organizing experience when ordinary identity constraints are loosened. By temporarily suspending waking identity and becoming these perspectives, space is created for alternative worldviews to emerge. Identity becomes broader and less rigid, no longer confined to a single psychological center. IDL refers to the shifts as empathetic multi-perspectivalism, the capacity to inhabit multiple centers of experience without collapsing them into one dominant self. Identity moves from psychological geocentrism toward polycentrism, which more accurately reflects a universe without a privileged point of view. This expansion of identity has practical consequences. Fear arises when the other is experienced as alien, unpredictable, or threatening. When the other is included within identity through direct identification, its threatening quality often diminishes. What was once feared becomes intelligible, relatable, or at least familiar. As fear decreases, anxiety, which underlies many forms of psychological distress, is often reduced. This includes panic responses, phobias, post-traumatic reactivity, and recurrent nightmares. For this reality check, pause and notice where fear in your life is linked to rigid identity boundaries. Is there an other you consistently resist, avoid, or interpret as dangerous? What might change if that perspective were temporarily included rather than oppressed or opposed? You will deepen your learning if you write or record a deep reflection before moving on. This concludes the presentation component of this expression of healing, balancing, and transformation. Please now take your 10-question multiple choice quiz. Do the exercises associated with this particular unit. Breathing provides a universally accessible, non-conceptual anchor for awareness. IDL emphasizes awareness of 6 distinct phases of every breath, not to control breathing, but to refine attentional resolution. These are abdominal inhalation, chest inhalation, pause, chest exhalation, abdominal exhalation, and a longer pause after exhalation. Awareness of these 6 stages of every breath trains sensitivity to process rather than content, reinforcing transformation at the level of perception itself. Incubation as intentional participation. Dream incubation in IDL is not wish fulfillment. It is a practice of aligning intention with evolutionary emergence, especially as revealed through interviewed perspectives. By becoming one or more emerging potentials prior to sleep, intention becomes participatory rather than directive, inviting information rather than demanding outcomes. Transformation integrates multiple timescales and levels of organization. Incubation and meditation together allow practitioners to sense alignment between personal life direction and larger evolutionary currents. This includes microcosmic and personal, and macrocosmic and collective dimensions without grandiosity or abstraction. Congratulations! With this overview internalized, you are now equipped to dive into the nuts and bolts of IDL healing, balancing, and transformation. By doing so, you get out of your own way, improving your ability to help others to do the same.